Hello everybody. So I thought it might be an interesting idea to ask CHAT GPT some somewhat controversial questions, mostly ones that I kind of already have an opinion on, either from anthropology or classics or just academia at large. If you don't know what CHAT GPT is, it's an AI, and it's considered very advanced. It's kind of being used by a lot of people right now to write papers and stuff like that. So it's a bit of a controversy in and of itself. But yeah, I just wanted to ask it some questions. The first one that came to my mind that I'm going to be talking about in this video was Cleopatra Black? But for some reason it didn't want to answer that. But when I changed it to was Cleopatra African, it did work. So I'm just going to be doing that one instead. But yeah, I'm just going to show you like the chat logs. And I responded, quite a few times, so we'll kind of run through it, and then yeah, I've got like a couple other things to bring up when they're relevant. But yeah, I'm not going to be giving like too much context, I'd say, about either Cleopatra herself or the controversy in academia. Most of what I know about the controversy in academia comes from, well, most of what I know in general about this subject comes from this book, Race, Antiquity, and Its Legacy by Denise, Eileen, McCoskey, which is a really good book. I really recommend it. And then, as well as like Black Athena and sort of the general controversy surrounding that, yeah. But I'm definitely not an expert on this at all. So yeah, I definitely recommend you guys to read this book, and then also if you're interested, do your own research on it, and if you disagree about anything or if I'm wrong about anything, then obviously let me know. But yeah, let's just start. So yeah, I ask it, was Cleopatra African? And then it responds and it says, Cleopatra was of Macedonian Greek origin, yeah, sure, and was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. She was not of African descent. So she was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Obviously, that's how she inherited the throne. And it's also a bit weird saying Macedonian Greek origin, because that's sort of its own question. Obviously, in modern day, North Macedonia and Greece are different places. They're kind of beefing at the moment. But yeah, obviously Alexander the Great is considered Macedonian, but also considered Greek in a lot of contexts. I don't think that they're necessarily interchangeable, and I also don't think necessarily just saying Macedonian Greek is correct. But anyways, she was of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and yeah, so she was not of African descent, very concretely. So then I responded, but the Ptolemaics had been in Egypt for over 300 years before Cleopatra was born, and her ancestors may have taken Egyptian wives or concubines. Cleopatra also spoke fluent Egyptian. So obviously, yeah, 300 years is a really long time. And Alexandria became sort of this huge cosmopolitan city at the time with a lot of different people living there. It's actually one of the really cool things about the history of Alexandria. So 300 years, obviously, that's 4 generations at least. So that's a lot of time for, your bloodline to be mixed in with all sorts of different things. Being in Egypt that entire time, and there are academic claims that Cleopatra's grandmother was Egyptian, and you can look into that if you want. And then yeah, there's also been theories about whether her dad had taken like concubines. I mean, they definitely were taking concubines, but whether she was actually born from one of them. So that's sort of all part of the conversation. So anyways, it responds, while it is true that the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled over Egypt for several centuries before Cleopatra's birth, and that it is possible that her ancestors intermarried with Egyptians, the Ptolemies were of Greek origin and considered themselves Greek. Cleopatra was also fluent in several languages, including Greek and Egyptian, as she was well educated and had to be able to communicate with her subjects and political allies. However, it is not historically accurate to say that Cleopatra was of African descent. And I actually agree. I don't think it's historically accurate to say that Cleopatra was of African descent. I would also really contest saying it's historically accurate to say that she was of Greek descent. And then saying she's of Ptolemaic descent, it's like, Yeah, she is, but that doesn't really mean anything. Because, again, 300 years passed. And I guess we'll get into this more, but they wouldn't be identifying themselves as Greek, at least in the context, the modern context that we would use that word as in, you know, you're like racially Greek. Because obviously in the ancient world, the entire perception of race, which again, if you want to read this Denise Eileen McCoskey book, she goes into that a lot more, a lot better than I can. But anyways, I guess I'll just keep going. So it does admit that she's fluent, and that she had to use it to communicate with her subjects and political allies. That's true, yeah. That probably is why she was fluent in both Greek and Egyptian. I'm pretty sure it's also most of the like bureaucratic texts and like papyrus and stuff from Alexandria at this time were in Demotic. So yeah, it was sort of like a political language in that way. But I reply, many ethnic Egyptians, Nubians, and Jews also considered themselves Greek in Alexandria at this time, and it was likely a political and social identification rather than a racial one, which is sort of what I was talking about before. And again, if you want to look into this on your own, there's plenty of examples from a bunch of different papyrus and yeah, just different like bureaucratic texts from Alexandria at this time of basically people identifying as Greek with Egyptian names or having Egyptian and Greek names, and they were doing this for many different reasons, but it seems to generally be that Greek was sort of considered like a social identification that was sort of used if you were of the higher class. Greeks also paid less taxes than Egyptians in Alexandria at this time, which is really important to note, which meant that it was in everyone's best interest to identify as Greek if they could. So yeah, that includes the Egyptians and the Nubians, the Jews, really a whole bunch of different people, Arabians, and yeah, you can look into those texts if you want, but then it replies, you are correct that during the Ptolemaic period, many Egyptians, Nubians, and Jews in Alexandria identified themselves as Greek culture and language were dominant in the city. That I'm also not sure about. If Greek language was dominant in the city, that might be true. And then Greek culture, that's way too broad of a statement to just throw out there. I mean, it definitely wasn't Greek culture. You could say that it was not Egyptian culture, at least in the sense of what it would have been before the Ptolemaic dynasty. But anyways, the Ptolemies also encouraged the fusion of Greek and Egyptian cultures, okay, and many of the ruling dynasty took on Egyptian customs and even adopted Egyptian names, okay, yeah. However, this does not change the fact that the Ptolemies were of Greek origin and that Cleopatra was a member of this Greek dynasty. It was a political and social identification rather than a racial one. And this is where CHAT GPT sort of starts to show that it's not at, I guess, a level for this type of conversation yet, in my opinion, because it's sort of just contradicting itself really obviously here. Because on one hand, it's talking about trying to trace back her lineage to, like, you know, being certifiably Greek, but also it's conceding that it was a political and social identification rather than a racial one. So I was sort of confused there, and so I said, if it is a political and social identification, why is it not possible to claim that Cleopatra was in fact of African descent, right? Because a lot of people that were of African descent in Egypt at this time, that's what they were doing. And then it replies, it is not possible to claim that Cleopatra was of African descent because her heritage is well documented as being of Macedonian Greek origin. The Ptolemaic dynasty, of which she was a member of, was of Greek origin, and the historical record indicates that the Ptolemies considered themselves Greek. Additionally, Cleopatra herself identified as Greek, and she was well educated in Greek culture and language. And again, saying she's well educated in Greek culture and language, well, she's also well educated in Egyptian culture and language, so it's not really indicative of anything. While it is true that the Ptolemies encouraged the fusion of Greek and Egyptian cultures and many members of the ruling dynasty took on Egyptian customs, it does not change the fact that Ptolemies were of Greek origin. It is important to note that this concept of race and ethnicity is a modern construct, okay? Ancient people did not have the same understanding of these concepts as we do today. So I guess part of this maybe is my questioning, because, yeah, this is true, That's kind of my whole point, is that this is true. But at the same time, it's still not budging on that they're of Greek origin, as in like their ancestry can be like traced directly back, right? And so, again, sort of going into the academic side of it, it is sort of a question that, yeah, the ramifications of it are like way bigger now than they actually would be. There's actually another, where is it, right here? This is a really great, just short article, if you're interested, by Denise, Eileen, McCoskey as well, but she has a really kind of cheeky, I guess, I don't know why I use that word, but quote at the end of it, says, "Let's start with the simple question, which false premise has had more disastrous historical consequences? That Cleopatra was black or that the Greeks were white?" So here she's kind of just pointing out the fact that neither of these people, you know, the Cleopatra or the Greeks at large, were identifying themselves with these words. There's really no indication that that was the case at all. And so by sort of grafting our own identity politics of today and like kind of putting them on there, it becomes its own sort of intense thing, which is sort of a big thing in classics in general. I've noticed it's like very like factionalized. Like it's very important for people that Cleopatra is of like a specific descent, even though it wouldn't have mattered to her, because it allows them to claim some type of credit in a way for, I mean, yeah, I guess for Cleopatra because she's quite famous and yeah, obviously I don't even necessarily know if she would be considered like a fantastic ruler. She was, you know, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but I mean, she got in war with Rome, so anyways, let me try to get back on track here. So yeah, I said, please give me the Cleopatra's documented Macedonian Greek heritage, because it said that it's documented, but it's actually not. There's no documented, like, family, the way that you can look at a family tree of, like, Queen Elizabeth today or something and see, like, how she goes back, like the royal family tree, like, that's not a thing for Cleopatra. There's gaps in it, and no one is entirely sure. So it replies, Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was of Macedonian Greek origin. The Ptolemies were a Greek family that ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, the founder of the dynasty. Ptolemy I Soter was a general in Alexander's army, yeah, and was appointed satrap of Egypt by Alexander himself, yes. The Ptolemies maintained their Greek identity throughout their rule of Egypt, and were heavily influenced by Greek culture and language. Maintain their Greek identity, again, it's sort of misleading, but Cleopatra was also well educated in Greek culture and language and identified herself as Greek. And this is a common thing you'll notice as we continue here, is that it's always saying these things, but it's never actually providing like what I'm asking for, right? Because it's saying Ptolemy I, yeah, Ptolemy I, and we know that in some way, or at least it can be presumed to a pretty accurate level, that she's you know, directly related to him, barring some type of, you know, Game of Thrones situation, which I guess is not entirely impossible either, considering the Ptolemies did practice marrying their brothers and sisters. Actually, Cleopatra is likely married to her brother. But anyways, okay, but please show me the full documentation of Cleopatra's heritage, tracing back to Ptolemy I, right? Because it didn't. And then it says, the full documentation of Cleopatra's heritage, tracing back to Ptolemy I, is not available, as many historical records from ancient Egypt were lost or destroyed over time. However, based on the historical records that have survived, it is known that Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was of Macedonian Greek origin. The Ptolemies were a Greek family that ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. The founder of the dynasty, Ptolemy I, was a general in the army, blah blah blah. And it is believed that Cleopatra was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and was the last of the Ptolemies to rule Egypt. The Ptolemies maintained their Greek identity, blah blah blah, was blah blah blah. So, again, that was pointless. Please give me an example of Cleopatra identifying herself as Greek, right? Because that's what, this is actually more important than the lineage anyways, as we've kind of established from the fact that they wouldn't have identified themselves in those racial terms anyways. But yeah, Cleopatra also identified as Egyptian on numerous occasions and was described as such during the War of Actium by Romans, notably by Octavius. So this was sort of an unfair thing to say to it, because although that's true, Rome had their own sort of intentions, you could say, going into that, because it was essentially a civil war between Octavius and Mark Antony. So, but the Romans were all tired of civil war, so they're trying to paint Cleopatra as sort of like this tempting seductress from Egypt that they can sort of transplant this war as to being on, so the Romans have support for it. So then CHAT GPT says, Cleopatra is known to have identified herself as both Greek and Egyptian throughout her life. So again, it's sort of agreeing with me, but also then saying I'm completely wrong. She was well educated in Greek culture and language and was fluent in several languages. As the ruler of Egypt, she was the embodiment of the pharaohs and therefore identified with ancient Egyptian royal lineage. The Ptolemaic dynasty, of which she was a member, encouraged the fusion of Greek and Egyptian cultures, and many members of the ruling dynasty took on Egyptian customs and even adopted Egyptian names. And then Cleopatra, given the title New Isis by her people, being the Egyptians. And in terms of the War of Actium, indeed, Octavius and other Roman authors referred to her as the Queen of Egypt, and sometimes as Cleopatra the Egyptian. And in that sense, she indeed identified as Egyptian. So this is, very confusing at this point. I think we got a little bit too deep in it with ChatGPT, and it's sort of clinging on to its original assertion while also it's kind of agreeing with everything I'm saying. Sort of like just regular people that you talk to in academia. So then finally I say, so please provide me with a historical example of Cleopatra identifying as Greek, right? Because there's a lot of historical examples of her identifying as Egyptian. And although I definitely would say that she did identify with Greek culture to an extent, I was just wondering what it would provide me with here. And it sort of just goes on about the same stuff again. I guess this is the only thing worth talking about. She also modeled herself on Greek Hellenistic monarchs such as Ptolemy II and Alexander the Great, and was often depicted on coinage with the features of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty. It is important to note that Cleopatra was also fluent in Egyptian and able to communicate with her subjects. So I guess the last couple of things I'll bring up here on that note is that, so saying she modeled herself on Greek Hellenistic monarchs, that I'm a little bit confused about that. I don't know if I would necessarily agree, but I mean, at the same time, everybody in the Mediterranean world was modeling themselves after Alexander the Great at that point, because why wouldn't you? But anyways, here we go. So I tried to find some pictures of the coins to show you guys, and yeah, I couldn't find anything where it's specifically talking about how she's being modeled after Aphrodite in a coin. But these are just some examples so that you can kind of look at them and decide for yourself. This forceful portrait of a masculine Cleopatra depicts her at half length with a striking necklace that was probably a gift from Mark Antony. So obviously it's hard to really say. It's really idiotic in my opinion when people look at someone that's sort of painted or sculpted, say in the style of like a Greek bust, and they're saying, oh, well, they're Greek. And it's like, well, the features that were on those busts are like the same for everybody, and they're not like entirely indicative of that person's actual appearance or like just the general appearance and like race of, Greeks or whatever. But yeah, that's Mark Antony. And then this one, I mean, obviously the coins didn't age well. This isn't really what I would consider. It's not what I picture when I picture Aphrodite, I guess, but I just thought they were worth showing. And then this is Caesarion, which is Caesar and Aphrodite's child. And this is kind of interesting because he has like an Egyptian kilt on. Again, this is kind of a common thing that they were doing, was sewing themselves in like Egyptian material because, that's who they were ruling over. This is something I just found on Wikipedia really quickly, but, Cleopatra is obviously being depicted as a pharaoh, and she's here and, or I don't know, this one, yeah, and she's presenting offerings to the goddess. Anyways, that's really, I didn't realize this was going to go on for so long. This isn't a very well made video, but let me see if there's any last things I'd like to bring up. I guess I'm just going to end on a couple quotes that I have here from African-American classicist Shelley Haley. I thought these might be good to end on, so I copied and pasted them here. So yeah, first one is, in the Black oral tradition, Cleopatra becomes a symbolic construction voicing our Black African heritage so long suppressed by racism and the ideology of miscegnation. When we say in general that the ancient Egyptians were black, we claim them as part of a culture and history that has known oppression and triumph, exploitation and survival. So yeah, that I think is really well put. And I think it's important that she specifies in general, because as I mentioned earlier, Alexandria in particular, but other parts of Egypt as well, were very cosmopolitan, at least by the time that, Cleopatra was around. And, the Egyptian people living there in Antiquity were not self-identifying as black. That's a modern label. Same situation with Cleopatra. And then last thing I'll say is just another quote from her, which is, irrespective of the tone of her skin color, the evidence for Cleopatra in Egypt strongly suggests that Cleopatra wanted to be seen as an Egyptian in her home country, and that her Greek heritage was neglected in favor of native Egyptian tradition. Scholars who have questioned Cleopatra's cultural affiliation with Greece and supported her Egyptian and African heritage have met with at best contempt and at worst the accusation that their arguments are unscholarly because they are influenced by their own cultural identity. So that's just going a bit more into the academic debate on it. Yeah, this video, I apologize for doing such a poor job trimming it down, but hopefully it was interesting. Thanks.